Since their founding in 1962, Korg has managed to make a huge name for themselves in the music world. From their classic and modern analog synths like the MS-20 and the Minilogue, to the genre-defining and studio-standard M1 and Triton, their products have been shaping popular music since their first synth left the doors. That's not to say all their products are well-known or remembered amongst musicians, however. With a legacy as big as theirs, some will obviously be forgotten, and in today's video, I want to highlight a synth in what I find to be one of their most fascinating product ranges, the AI² series. Starting in 1991 with the O1W, set to be their new flagship workstation after the M1 was starting to be phased out, the synth engine slowly trickled its way down from top of the line to average in budget, as newer and better engines took its place until it finally breathed its last breath in 1999. In those 8 years, Korg managed to put out just around 30 different models, each building on the last in terms of capabilities, features, pricing, and everything in between, and thankfully, I just so happen to have that very last model. Say hello to the NX5R, the successor to 1997's NS5R, itself a rack mount version of the N5 keyboard from the same year. It was a rather enticing synth for its time. Despite the small size of these things compared to competing products, they packed a lot of punch. Over 1,000 instrument presets, 47 effects with 2 effects slots, a 144x40 resolution graphic display, and in the case of the X and S, a daughterboard slot for even more sounds. And while it's true that all this had already been done by 1997, what makes this so impressive is the pricing that Korg was aiming for. The NS5R was $825 on launch, down to $625 2 years later, when the NX5R, rocking its Yamaha XG daughterboard, launched for $100 more, and it only cost $1,000 to get the N5X keyboard, a minor upgrade to the earlier N5. Comparing these to similar products from Roland and Yamaha, it's clear that Korg wasn't trying to win over musicians with revolutionary features, but pricing. And yet, even if this seems like a product that was dated for its time, the N5s are what I would consider some of Korg's best products now, with a sound that can be both gritty and soft at the same time, a simple yet powerful synthesis engine, and many sounds from prior AI² models, granting you access to a timeless library of sounds used by many musicians and in many great video games. So, some of you might be wondering, what exactly gives the N5 series these grand qualities? How easy are they to find? Do they work well now? And what one's right to buy now? In today's video, those questions and more will be answered. I'm Speedy, and welcome to the Korg N5 episode of Sound Profile. Before we dive deep into things, let's look at some basic specs. While what you get will vary between the 4 models, there's a number of things that stay consistent. The N5s feature 64 notes of polyphony, 16-part multi-timbrality over MIDI DIN or 32-part over RS-232C serial, over 30 drum kits, and over 1,000 stock instruments with a mixture of single voice programs and combinations created using the over 600 samples stored on 12 megabytes of ROM, over 45 effects with 2 usable simultaneously, a 144x40 display with green or orange backlighting, audio pass-through via RCA inputs, and 16-bit 32 kHz audio output via dual quarter-inch mono connectors. Quite a good feature list for a budget model, and that's without getting into the things unique to each of them. This is probably a good time to clarify that this video is primarily from the perspective of an NX5R owner, so many of the specific workflow quirks of the N5 and subsequent X won't be discussed here, although most of what I say will apply to them as well as the NS5R. Between the keyboard and racks, there isn't too much to go over. The keyboards have a standard performance menu added for more detailed control over playback of singular patches and combinations, more front panel buttons for greater ease of use, pedal inputs for volume and assignable controls, and of course a full set of 61 synth-style keys for your playing pleasure. Honestly, I don't think you're missing out on much if you already own a keyboard to control and play this thing from, and since I already have plenty of those, including some by Korg, I'm more than happy to keep my NX around, though I probably would have been fine if an NS as well. The most obvious change between these two is the aesthetics. Even at a distance, it isn't hard to tell them apart. While the NS uses a cool white and gray color scheme, not too dissimilar to the brighter look of the previously released Trinity synths, the NX uses a dark black that's more in line of other synths at the time. Which one you prefer is entirely of personal preference, but I will say there's something nice about how well the NX5R blends in with things. Another change that's of questionable essentiality is what's going on with the daughterboard slot internally. In an odd move, Korg opted not to use a proprietary expansion format like Yamaha had done with Plug and Roland had done with sRJV, but instead used the somewhat more standardized Wave Blaster header that was in some computer sound cards. Both of the N5Rs could be fitted with any Wave Blaster compatible card, like the Roland SCB55 or the Ensoniq Soundscape DB, to add a different flavor of sound, or as noted by some reviewers at the time, you could also add in a Korg AGWB card to get another 32 voices of polyphony and 16 parts of timbrality. Korg made this out to be a pretty big deal at the time if this advertisement is anything to go by, listing Wave Blaster compatibility as a bullet point and stating, WB compatible boards offer the user the opportunity to increase the NS5R's polyphony and add more sound programs. Quite the smart move for the space-conscious desktop user they were trying to market to. And while all this expansion stuff was totally optional with the NX users were forced into having one no matter what. Specifically, these come with a Yamaha DB51XG. This adds 16 channels of 32 voice polyphonic Yamaha XG sounds to the module, which sound nothing like what's already on board the unit. A great choice at the time, but nowadays, I guess it depends on how much you like Yamaha XG sounds. With that out of the way, let's get back to the model I have on hand, and man, these units are just freaking stylish! The NX5R here is coated in a deep dark black, with a frame made primarily out of metal for all except the hard plastic front panel that houses the dot matrix screen, 4 tiny little LED access lights, 9 rubber buttons, and a big old jog dial. It's a very aesthetically pleasing unit to look at when it's running at full steam. The screen that can switch between green and orange on a dime is always super nice, especially with all the different colored lights going on and the niceness extends to the back of the unit. Flipping it over to that side reveals an assortment of back-located things, including free MIDI ports, MIDI in, out, and through, an RS-232C serial connector for hooking directly up to an old-school Windows or Mac computer, 2 quarter-inch mono outputs for stereo sound, stereo inputs over RCA, a volume adjust knob for the daughterboard, and a polarized figure 8 port for giving power from the wall to the internal supply. Although on the N5 keyboard, an external supply is used here, connected by an oddball 9V 4-pin DIN connector Korg used on a few other products. It's a decent assortment of stuff for a budget sound module, but compared to more professional ones, I would have expected more, at least another set of outputs in place of RCA inputs. But hey, it is still a budget module at the end of the day, and that is really reflected in design, looking more like a beefed up sound canvas than say a Triton or a Trinity. The only other issue I really take with the back here is the singular MIDI input. Bear in mind that a single MIDI connection can only carry 16 channels of timbrality max, which means that not only are the other 16 locked off, but the 16 parts of multi-timbrality added by your expansion card are shared with the N5 16 parts. So those other 16 channels and the 16 added by your expansion card are never to be seen, locked away and hidden from you unless you use an antiquated serial port, which is, well, that isn't exactly happening unless you have an old computer laying around. For now, let's put those gripes aside and crack this thing open. Getting a look inside isn't too tough here, just pop the 4 total screws on the left and right sides off, and then the 9 on the back, keeping in mind that there's 2 different sizes that you should be keeping track of. Just have some patience and write down where everything goes, and in time you'll be able to slide the top right off. And immediately upon peering inside the rather beautiful insides, there's one very odd thing that stands out: the power supply. In an abnormal move for a module of this size from the 90s, it uses a wire block to change between 100 and 117 volts and 220 to 240 volts. On top of that, this unit can tolerate both 60 and 50 Hz frequencies, meaning that it can even function in countries like South Korea that operate at the odd 220 volt 60 Hz. There's also some very basic but noteworthy safety features. The connector only has one way to go in correctly with the removal clip facing the plastic cover on the right side of the connection, and there's fuses for both of the lines, so even if you plug it into an over or underpowered wall socket, you still won't be able to fry anything as the fuse will blow and prevent power from going any further and damaging anything. Okay, I think that's enough talk about power supplies. Buried under the Yamaha board here is the adorably tiny CPU, a Hitachi H8 over 3002, part of their ever-popular H8 family that can be found in a ton of synthesizers from the time, like the Sound Canvas SC55, SC88 Pro, Yamaha FS1R, and many others. It's a 32-bit RISC-based microprocessor, and while I couldn't find anything indicating a particular clock speed on the inside, it's probably safe to assume it's at the CPU's max of 17 MHz. Next up are the two huge honkin' proprietary Korg AI² chips that are either present or had similar versions put in other products, which work in unison to handle all things related to sound generation and output, and those get their sound sources from 12 megabytes of PCM ROM, containing 528 instrument samples and 286 drum kits. Speaking of memory though, one thing that might seem odd is that there isn't any battery here for storing data after the unit's powered off. This is because the N5s use flash memory, an option that has the upside of less user maintenance and less failure due to bad batteries, but has to be actually written to in order to store any sort of data, which means that any changes you make while in the multi-timbral mode need to be flashed every time before powering the unit off. There's also the DAC, again buried under a Yamaha board, a Burr Brown PCM 1717E, which provides stereo 16-bit audio output at an unspecified rate, presumably 32 kHz, with some rather pristine and rich quality. Deep bass tones, rich mids, and impressive highs make this one very balanced, as all DACs should be. The remainder of what's in here is just a bunch of various bits and pieces to make all the magic come together, so I think it's time to button it all back up and get it going with the fairly typical setup process. The 1/4-inch audio outputs go to your audio interface or other thing to receive audio, MIDI goes to your interface, in my case a MIDI Sport 4x4, and you can use a fairly generic power plug that you probably have laying around to provide it some much needed juice from the wall, and then fire it up by clicking the power button that doubles as a volume knob? Can't say I've ever seen that on any other synth I own, but hey, it works. Once that excellent boot up screen is over, it's off to the races with a multitude of marvelous menus to move merrily through, so let's work our way through them, starting with the demos. This is where I imagine a lot of people went straight to back in the day, as it allows you to check out the capabilities of your N5, as demonstrated by the tunes 2000 Fever and Mission Man on the N5 and N5 racks, although these were replaced by some new ones on the N5X. Regardless of what model you get though, it's all delightfully 90s with guitar slides, glittery pads, and tiger noises. Yep, that was worth the ROM space. Perhaps the most important menu is the one that the unit initially boots into though, Multi. This is, as the name would imply, where you can set up a multi-timbral performance for either live play or music composition with the aid of a MIDI sequencer, be it hardware like the ones featured on the Korg Trinity and the Yamaha RM1X, or software on a home computer, like I'll be doing here with Logic Pro 10, but anything will work. From here, you can access the parameters of all 16 individual parts, patch bank for changing between each of the bank of 128 sounds, instrument for picking one of those sounds, transpose for changing pitch, channel receive, volume, expression, panning, reverb, chorus, effects bank, and effects number. It's a pretty basic setup, and to Korg's credit, they got it right. The screen is laid out and made in such a way that a quick glance is all you need to parse what's going on. Probably the most important thing is that most values are represented in an abstract way, with dials and knobs instead of numbers. It decreases accuracy at a glance, but makes it far easier to understand things when just breezing through menus, and you still get access to the full breadth of info when going in to edit those values. Patch selection, on the other hand, is something the N5s have gotten a bit of flack for over the years due to how it works. Rather than sorting things in its own way or strictly following the various MIDI standards at the time like GM, GS, and XG, it kinda does both. The first bank you're greeted by upon starting the unit is the GM bank, with 128 basic sounds, or capital tones, sorted according to spec, but you can also access all the different banks that were used for the Roland GS and Yamaha XG standards. So a lot of the time I found myself picking sounds by knowing what kind of basic tone that I wanted, and then moving through the banks until I found a variation that I liked. this can be cumbersome because Korg was insistent on showing every bank select used by the devices across all sounds as opposed to just the ones that are relevant to the capital tone you chose, leading to a ton of annoying duplicates that you have to look through, and while I did sorta get used to it eventually, I can't say I felt like I ever truly saw everything there was to see here. For example, I didn't even know there was an FM bass sound on this thing until I was peering through the manual because it was just buried in a million presets. Thankfully, something that's a lot easier to stomach is the 384 patches not fitting into any of those pre-existing specs. And those fit into the program's A, B, and C banks of the unit, sitting right alongside a user bank for 128 of your own sounds, and free combination banks that effectively add another set of 384 sounds plus 128 user sounds. There is absolutely no logic to how these are sorted as far as I could tell, which isn't anything out of the norm for a synth, but is a really big contrast to the attempt at sorting presented with the GM type sounds. But again, it isn't that big of a deal as you can get used to it quickly, and all's forgiven once you actually start playing around with the sounds here. This thing is best summed up as an amalgamation of pretty much every synthesizer of the late 80s and early 90s. You got some very DX7-like basses and electric pianos, rich pads like a Workstation, cheesy pianos like an M1, bright and glittery patches like a D50, and all with some subtle and not so subtle differences in sound that lead to the N5 having a very unique character of its own, and it's also totally capable of doing things that those couldn't. It's also an amalgamation in that the patch selection here is a mixture of old and new AI² sounds, with returning classics like Analog Pad and Halifax of the O1W, Sunrise from the X5, and yeah, actually it's mostly old stuff in the program banks here, which makes these things almost like a best of AI² compilation, with a bunch of new sounds peppered in here and there, and tucked away in those questionably sorted GM type banks. That's fine by me though, as I love these old presets and take a particular interest in them, being that they are featured in tons of game soundtracks like Castlevania Symphony of the Night and Rondo of Blood by Konami, Virtual On by Sega, Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time by Nintendo, and so on and so forth, so having even just a little slice of those sounds makes me happy. And just for some clarification, the N5 keyboards actually have unique patch and combination banks from the modules, with some totally new sounds, some different repeats, and some identical patches put in different spots, but you'll be getting an equally great experience no matter what you choose. But yeah, going through the presets to demo them for this video, as well as find ones to use for making music, I was impressed by just how well some of them have held up. While many of the acoustic sounds now are kinda a lot of the synth sounds are still awesome and don't sound anything like any of the other synths that I own. This thing is just super unique and pretty darn inspiring to pick up and play. It's not often I find a synth where I can just pick a sound and suddenly have 12 hours pass by with a completed track in hand, but that's exactly what happened when working with the N5 for me. It ain't all sunshine and rainbows though. Besides the minor sound sorting gripe I mentioned earlier, there's still one big issue I have with the N5, and that is the effects section. For reference, I was expecting something along the lines of other synths I have from the time, where there's a dedicated effects section for reverb and chorus, with the insertion effects that were advertised for the unit being added on top of that, with the ability to change how much of the modified signal makes it through, or at least the ability to toggle the effect on and off per part. And a quick glance for how effects supposedly worked kinda supported this idea, because you're able to route them in different ways. You can send them after all the sound of outputs A and B is done, or send them through C and D in different ways, as well as adjust the amount of the patch that makes it through output C and D. Except this device only has 2 outputs. You're always outputting through A and B, which means the C and D send parameters and the options are useless and exist because Korg was too lazy to remove them, I guess, because they ported the firmware for these things down from the slightly higher end N1 that does have C and D outputs, so you can send audio out through ports that literally don't exist, so it just reroutes it to A and B, which is it's just brilliant, it's perfect! Okay, so the way effects actually work here is that they're global and can be either placed after the reverb and chorus, affecting all sound output from the device, or they can take the place of the reverb and chorus effects, giving you precise per part control at the cost of not having reverb and chorus anymore. It's a really weird and janky setup that's pretty much identical to the one Korg used on every prior AI² synth, and the fact it hasn't been updated since 1991's O1W really shows. It's a shame too, because the effects here are of typical awesome Korg quality, with some particularly great guitar distortion effects, fun reverb, great chorusing, and so on, but unless you're using this synth for a single sound, this is definitely one that I feel must be used with external effects to get the most out of it. Speaking of getting the most out of it, let's talk about making your own sounds. By holding down the edit button while on either the bank or program select, you'll enter the sound edit mode where any and all relevant parameters about the AI² patch are revealed to you. So now's probably a good time to explain how sound generation works here. Every patch starts out as one of 528 multi-samples, consisting of everything from pianos to analog pads, and a mixture of new samples and old ones from the M1 and the like. And yes, those are multi-samples, not regular samples, which means things like pianos will automatically change sample based on where you're playing, saving you the effort of having to set up key ranges over multiple patch parts. This multi-sample acts as an oscillator of sorts that can have pitch adjustments made via a low-frequency operator with 6 waveforms and attack decay release envelopes. These are then sent over to cutoff and volume envelopes, which both get their own LFOs and ADR envelopes, with the process being repeatable once again to create a patch with 2 parts, before the final result is routed for the main outputs. It's a simple setup that isn't as crazy as, say, an FM synthesizer or some of Korg's higher-end offerings like the Trinity, and it also has the rather annoying and confusing flaw of having absolutely no resonant filter at all. But what really holds it all together is that the multi-samples stored on ROM are just awesome, so it doesn't take much but a bit of creativity and simple sound programming knowledge to make your own sounds. It's something that's quite commendable in an era of increasingly more complicated digital synths, just as commendable as the fact that the editing UI doesn't suck. All the things you'll be changing are broken down into a series of easy to understand menus that can be accessed from the main edit page or by pressing part page to cycle through, and the enter key to cycle through the first and second oscillator options. You also get a full bank of 128 patches to store your sounds in, so you shouldn't have to worry about running out of space to store your sounds. Thankfully, you also don't need to save entirely new patches if you just want to make small tweaks for one track, as the part edit menu in the options allows you to do things like add, release, and attack to a sound's pitch and volume envelopes, change the cutoff, and so on. All of handy little pop-ups showing you how your changes affect things against the original patch. There's a bunch of other things you can do from the options here too, like changing the backlight color between green and orange, performing a factory reset, and perhaps most important, saving your current multi-timbral setup to memory in one of 4 slots, effectively allowing you to work on 4 different tunes at the same time, or have 4 live performance setups, all without saving data to a MIDI file. If you're adverse to doing all this on the unit itself though, then you're in luck, as Korg did release an editor for the N5 on Windows 3.1 and classic Mac OS, creatively named the N5 N1 Sound Editor. It's also the only editor for these things that I'm aware of, as seemingly no one else wanted to make one. And it's perfectly okay. It's pretty much the same as editing on the unit itself, but instead of all the screens being sized to a 144x40 dot matrix display, it's all fit to whatever resolution your computer is running at. It didn't really make editing any easier in my opinion though, and the fact that it requires DOSBox to run the Windows version or setting up a cumbersome emulator for the 68K Mac version makes it not really worth the effort to me. With all that said, I think it's time to show off what this thing is really capable of. As per usual, I've put in a mixture of solo sound demos, covers, original tunes, and music from friends to give you a broad selection of samples to enjoy. Like I said before, I really do think this thing is at its best when used with external effects. The N5s can definitely sound cool by themselves, but once you start applying some high quality effects from a sound processor or plugins in a DAW, it absolutely shines in a way that I think is really special. Something that is perhaps a little less special that I've been neglecting to talk about is the GM, GS, and XG compatibility here. This was something that Korg was quite proud of when the device was out, displaying it all over the advertising material and putting a solid effort towards making it all work. So, is this the best synth for playing back some standardized MIDI tunes? Maybe. It really all depends on your personal taste, but Korg definitely didn't misplace their faith in the unit when advertising its GM and GS capabilities. While the sound doesn't quite have the same balance as the SC55 that so many of these tunes were composed on, nor the pleasing highs of that unit, the volume balance can get fairly close and the instrument picks are pretty solid for the most part. I don't know whether I'd rate it a notch above Yamaha's offerings with their MU units, GM, and mostly unofficial GS support, but you can definitely do much worse than this thing, and it's certainly way better than a Roland JV in GM mode. But that's just my opinion, and I'm curious to hear what yours is. The only major complaint I really have is that the drums don't behave well when bank select commands are sent on their channel, at least in GM mode, often turning them into melodic instruments of some sort. The workaround for this that I've found is to put the N5 into Roland GS mode and disable GM resets, allowing you to enjoy most general MIDI soundtracks without having to mess with the drums constantly. Yamaha XG, on the other hand, is fascinating. Now, I'm not talking about how XG works and sounds on the NX5R's XG expansion card. What I am talking about is the NS5R and presumably the regular N5's attempts at playing back XG MIDIs using the built-in Korg sounds. The reason this is so interesting to me is that XG is a rather complex standard, with tons of extra sounds and a variation effect that can act as delay, distortion, flanger, etc., so you pretty much never see devices with unofficial support for it. In fact, the only other example of this that I could find is the hidden XG compatibility mode of the Roland SC88 Pro and SC8850, which, to be frank, sounds really bad. While the XG mode here doesn't try and replicate the variation effects, which Roland's didn't either, so that's fair game, it does have patches in place for all the variation sounds, and the results are all over the board in terms of quality, judging by the samples provided by Haru MKT. Some tracks sound amazing and on par for a real XG device, while others are noticeably wrong. It's a crapshoot, but a very fascinating crapshoot nonetheless. Still, if all the good things and the demos I showed were enough to get you interested in buying one of these, then perhaps it's time to talk about pricing. Depending on the model you want to get, you can be looking at spending anywhere from $100 to $400. The N5 and N5X keyboards cost anywhere from $250 to $400 on average, depending on shipping price and condition, while the NS5R tops out at around $160 on average and goes as low as $100, which is quite a fair price for what you're getting. The same cannot be said about the NX5R though. These things don't really have a set price. I paid $130 for mine, but I've seen some people pay $100 and others paying $300 frickin' dollars. They're also incredibly rare too, which makes finding them a challenge, let alone at a good price. It's because of that I'm holding onto mine for dear life now, and I encourage others to seek out the functionally near identical and much cheaper NS5R if you want your rack mount N5 fix, or just to pick up one of the keyboards if money and space permits. And of course, you got the alternatives to consider. Primarily, it's the rest of the N series. The earlier N264 and N364 are both well-loved keyboards, especially within the Latin American community, community apparently, and they sound completely awesome as well. In terms of features, however, they're pretty much identical to the N5s, but with less multi-samples and less presets, with the only truly standout addition being that they have Korg's real-time pattern play record function that's become a staple on their workstations. Does that make them worth a crazy high entry fee of around $500 to $700? Probably not, but they're worth noting just as much as the N1 and N1R, the higher end versions of the N5 and NS5R respectively that bear many similarities but have a few important tweaks, like the addition of a resonance filter as an effect, 2 pairs of outputs for better control over sounds and effects routing, greater front panel control on the rack version, a brand new piano sound, and so on and so forth. These are undoubtedly superior to their N5 counterparts, but whether or not they're worth the extra money is up for debate. The N1 costs anywhere from $100 to $300 more than the N5 or N5X, while the N1R is about $100 more than an NS5R, costing around $250 on the regular. I don't think the minor improvements are worth it nowadays, especially since you're starting to approach Korg Triton and Trinity pricing at that point, but your mileage may vary. Now, there's one very bizarre model of the N1 that also deserves mention, primarily just due to how oddly specific it is. It is the Whole Tone Revolution by Chromatone. This odd thing is a third-party modified version of an N1 keyboard, which has a repainted chassis with new decals, and most obviously, the regular keybed has been replaced with one of a Yonko layout. Is it better than a regular piano? Probably not, but it's a curious experiment that's attracted a few people who stand by it as a great option for playing music. If you want to get one of these yourself though, you can expect to pay a pretty penny. When they're in stock on Chromatone's website, they cost somewhere around $1,300 US and can fetch anywhere from that up to $3,000 on Reverb and eBay on the rare occasion they even come up. No matter what you do though, the takeaway from all this is that the N5s are awesome. While I was initially a little iffy on whether or not I'd like it or even want to keep it when time came around to write this review, just a little bit of time was enough to show me that this is undoubtedly one of the most powerful hidden weapons in my arsenal of synthesizers. So few people talk about just how much you can do with this thing, from atmospheric and gritty pads to punchy and standout leads and thumping drums to rich basses. This thing manages to be everything I love about ROMplers in one tiny little box, and given their often rather low price, I simply cannot recommend buying one enough.